The handcuffs clicked against Olivia Taylor's wrists with the finality of a coffin lid closing. The metal was cold against her skin, still warm from washing dishes at Manny's diner where she'd worked the breakfast shift just 3 hours earlier. Detective Rodriguez's grip was firm but not cruel as he guided her toward the unmarked sedan, past the gathering crowd of neighbors who had known her for 15 years. Mrs. Chen from the corner market stood frozen on her porch, a bag of groceries forgotten at her feet. Tommy Valdez, barely 16, pressed his face against his bedroom window on the second floor of the duplex across the street. His mother had hired Olivia to tutor him in algebra just last month. Now he watched as the woman who'd patiently explained mathematical equations was being charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across 47th Street in Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, illuminating the peeling paint on shotgun houses that had weathered decades of hurricanes and gentrification attempts. Olivia's own house, a modest blue bungalow with white trim she'd painted herself last spring, sat behind the police tape like a stage set, waiting for the next act of a tragedy no one could have scripted. "You have the right to remain silent," Detective Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying across the street despite his attempt to speak quietly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Olivia nodded, though her mind felt detached from her body. She'd heard these words countless times on television, never imagining they would be spoken to her. Her lawyer would tell her later that she should have demanded to call an attorney immediately. But in that moment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of her neighborhood, the distant salsa music from Ramon's auto shop, the hiss of the city bus stopping at the corner, children's laughter from the elementary school playground 3 blocks away, she felt as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. The charges were incomprehensible. Marcus Williams, 34, found shot twice in the chest in his apartment on Calle Ocho. Teresa Martinez, 28, discovered 3 days later in her car behind the Publix where she worked as a cashier, a single bullet wound to the head. James Thompson, 41, killed in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong outside his apartment complex in Overtown, though nothing had been taken from his wallet or vehicle. 3 victims, 3 different neighborhoods, 3 different methods. The only connection the police had found, they claimed, was Olivia Taylor. Detective Martinez, Rodriguez's partner, emerged from Olivia's house carrying a clear evidence bag. Inside, Olivia could see her grandmother's prayer book, the one she'd inherited 5 years ago when Abuela Carmen had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The leather was worn smooth from decades of handling, its pages filled with handwritten notes in Spanish and English, pressed flowers from Palm Sunday services, and holy cards collected from funerals of neighbors and friends. "Why are you taking that?" Olivia asked, finding her voice for the first time since they'd knocked on her door. "It belonged to my grandmother." Detective Martinez looked up from labeling the bag. "Evidence, ma'am. We'll return your personal items once the investigation is complete." The crowd had grown larger. Mr. Fernandez from the bodega had left his store unlocked to stand on the sidewalk, his arms crossed over his guayabera. Maria Santos clutched her rosary beads, the same ones she carried to morning mass at St. Agnes every day at 6 a.m. These were people who had known Olivia since she'd moved to the neighborhood as a 20-year-old nursing student. They'd watched her graduate, struggle through her mother's cancer treatment, celebrate small victories, and mourn quiet losses. Father Miguel from St. Agnes pushed through the crowd, his collar slightly askew as though he'd dressed hastily. "Olivia," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to providing comfort in times of crisis. "I'm calling Sister Catherine right now. She knows some good lawyers." Rodriguez paused before opening the car door. "Ma'am, is there someone you'd like us to contact? Family member?" Olivia's mother lived in Orlando now, in a retirement community near Disney World where the air smelled like orange blossoms instead of exhaust fumes, and where her days were filled with water aerobics and bridge games instead of the constant worry that had defined her years in Miami. Olivia couldn't bear the thought of that phone call, couldn't imagine explaining something she didn't understand herself. "My supervisor at the hospital," she said quietly. "Nancy Kim in the ICU. She should know I won't be coming in for my shift tonight." The irony wasn't lost on her. For 12 years, Olivia had worked as a registered nurse in the intensive care unit at Jackson Memorial Hospital. She'd held the hands of dying patients, comforted grieving families, and fought alongside doctors to save lives that seemed beyond saving. She'd worked double shifts during the nursing shortage of 2001, had volunteered for hurricane relief efforts, had donated blood so many times that the Red Cross sent her thank you cards addressed to "our hero" in scrubs. Now, she was being accused of taking 3 lives. As Rodriguez helped her into the back seat of the sedan, Olivia caught sight of her reflection in the window. She looked exactly as she had that morning when she'd tied her dark hair back in a ponytail and applied the same subtle makeup she'd worn for years, a touch of mascara, a hint of lipstick that complemented her warm brown skin. She was 35 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, devoted to her work and her community. She volunteered at the free clinic on Saturdays, taught Sunday school to children whose parents worked multiple jobs and had never received so much as a speeding ticket. The sedan pulled away from the curb, and Olivia watched her neighborhood recede through the rear window. Mrs. Chen had finally picked up her groceries, but stood rooted to her porch, watching the car disappear. Tommy Valdez had opened his window and was leaning out, his young face a mask of confusion and disbelief. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The last thing Olivia saw before they turned the corner was Father Miguel blessing himself, his lips moving in what she knew was a prayer for her soul. At the Miami-Dade Police Department, the processing felt surreal and methodical. Fingerprints pressed onto cards with practiced efficiency. A mugshot taken with a camera that flashed too brightly. Personal effects inventoried and sealed in manila envelopes. Her grandmother's silver cross necklace, her house keys on a keychain shaped like a stethoscope, $43 in cash, and the small notebook where she kept track of her patients' favorite songs and family details. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and despair. Olivia sat on the narrow bench and tried to make sense of the timeline the detectives had presented. According to their theory, she had somehow murdered Marcus Williams on a Tuesday night when she'd been working a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Security footage and patient records would prove her whereabouts, surely. Sandra Martinez had been killed on a Friday evening when she had been at her book club discussing Like Water for Chocolate with 8 other women in Elena Vasquez's living room. James Thompson's murder allegedly occurred on a Sunday morning when Olivia was leading the children's choir at St. Agnes, teaching 7-year-olds to sing This Little Light of Mine in Spanish. But as the hours passed in the holding cell, doubt began to creep into her certainty like water through cracks in a foundation. She had met Marcus Williams, hadn't she? 2 months ago, when he'd been brought to the ICU after a car accident. She'd cared for him during his recovery, had listened to him talk about his plans to go back to school, to become a teacher like his mother had been. When he was discharged, he'd hugged her and promised to send her a graduation photo when he finished his degree. Sandra Martinez had been a patient too, briefly, when she'd come to the emergency room with chest pains that turned out to be anxiety attacks. Olivia had sat with her during the long wait, had talked her through breathing exercises, had given her the phone number for the community mental health clinic. Sandra seemed so young, so frightened of her own mortality. And James Thompson, yes, she remembered him too, a diabetic who had been in and out of the hospital for complications. His sister had been frantic, torn between caring for him and working enough hours to keep their shared apartment.
Olivia had helped them apply for assistance programs, had made sure James understood his medication schedule, had even driven him to a follow-up appointment on her day off when his sister couldn't get time off work.
Three people whose lives had intersected with hers through her work at the hospital. Three people who had trusted her with their vulnerability, their pain, their hope for healing. Three people who were now dead, and somehow, impossibly, she was being blamed for their murders. As night fell over Miami and the holding cell grew darker, Olivia pressed her face to the small window and looked up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. She thought of her grandmother's prayer book, now sitting in an evidence room somewhere in this same building. Abuela Carmen had always said that God tests those he loves most, that faith isn't proven in times of peace, but in moments of absolute darkness. But what kind of test required the deaths of three innocent people? What kind of faith could survive being accused of destroying the very lives she had devoted her career to saving? The questions echoed in the darkness, unanswered and seemingly unanswerable, as Olivia Taylor, nurse, volunteer, beloved member of her community, began the first night of what would become the most challenging period of her life. Somewhere in Miami, three families were planning funerals. Somewhere in Little Havana, her neighbors were trying to reconcile the woman they knew with the crimes she was accused of committing. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the justice system, evidence was being cataloged, witnesses were being interviewed, and a case was being built that would either vindicate an innocent woman or reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone could imagine. The Miami-Dade County Jail processed Olivia Taylor at 3:17 a.m. on a Wednesday morning in March 2003. The fluorescent lights hummed with the persistence of insects, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made even the healthiest complexions look jaundiced. Olivia's booking photo would later appear on the front page of the Miami Herald, but the woman staring back at the camera bore little resemblance to the vibrant nurse who had started her shift at Jackson Memorial just 18 hours earlier. Her cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and a small sink that dripped with metronomic regularity. The walls were painted institutional green, a color that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who looked at it too long. Olivia sat on the edge of the cot and tried to catalog the events that had led her here, but her mind kept returning to the expression on Detective Rodriguez's face when he'd read the charges. He'd looked sorry, not satisfied, not triumphant, sorry, as though he were delivering news of a terminal diagnosis rather than making an arrest he believed was justified. The first morning brought a court-appointed attorney named David Brennan, a tired-looking man in his 50s who carried a briefcase held together with duct tape and spoke with the weary efficiency of someone who had fought too many losing battles. He sat across from her in the visiting room, a space that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies and broken dreams, and spread her case file across the metal table. "The evidence is circumstantial but substantial," he said without preamble. "All three victims were patients of yours at some point. You had access to their personal information, their addresses, their schedules. The prosecution is arguing that you used your position at the hospital to target vulnerable people." Olivia's hands trembled as she reached for the water cup he'd brought her. "David, I helped those people. I saved Marcus's life when he came in after that car accident. His blood pressure dropped so low we almost lost him, but I caught it in time. I stayed 2 hours past my shift to make sure he was stable." The prosecution sees that differently. They're saying you formed an emotional attachment to your patients that became twisted over time. They have a psychological profile that suggests... A psychological profile? Olivia's voice rose, causing the guard by the door to look up from his magazine. "Based on what? I've never even had a speeding ticket. I volunteer at the free clinic. I teach Sunday school." Brennan pulled out a folder marked with her name. "They interviewed your co-workers, your neighbors, your pastor. Most of the feedback was positive, but there were some concerns raised about your intensity regarding patient care." The words hit her like a physical blow. Intensity?
Several nurses mentioned that you sometimes took patient deaths harder than most, that you would stay late to sit with dying patients even when it wasn't your assignment, that you kept detailed notes about patients' personal lives, their families, their fears, their hopes for healing. Brennan looked up from the file. The prosecution is arguing that this pattern shows an unhealthy obsession with controlling life and death.
Olivia closed her eyes and saw Sandra Martinez as clearly as if she were standing in the room. 28 years old, working 2 jobs to support her elderly mother, suffering from panic attacks that she was convinced were heart problems. Sandra had gripped Olivia's hand during her EKG, her palms slicked with sweat, her voice barely a whisper as she confessed her terror of dying young like her father had. "I sat with her because she was scared," Olivia said quietly. "She didn't have anyone else there. Her mother was at home recovering from hip surgery, and Sandra couldn't afford to miss work for what might turn out to be nothing. So I stayed with her until the test results came back clear. I gave her information about anxiety support groups. I followed up because that's what nurses do. We care." "I understand that," Brennan said, "but the prosecution has painted a different picture. They're saying you became fixated on these patients, that you couldn't handle it when they moved on with their lives without your involvement." The accusation was so foreign to Olivia's understanding of herself that she felt as though they were discussing a stranger. In her 12 years as a nurse, she had cared for thousands of patients. She remembered many of them, certainly. It was impossible to forget the teenager who'd survived a motorcycle accident against all odds, or the elderly woman who died peacefully, surrounded by 4 generations of her family, or the young father who'd beaten cancer and returned to the ICU 2 years later to show her photos of his daughter's first steps. But fixated? Obsessed? The words felt like accusations against her fundamental nature. What about alibis? "I was working when Marcus was killed. There are security cameras, time cards, patient charts I signed." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The timeline is complicated. Marcus Williams was killed on a Tuesday night, but the coroner's report suggests the time of death could have been anywhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Your shift ended at 11 p.m. that night." Olivia's memory of that evening came back in fragments. She'd been caring for Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly diabetic who'd been admitted with complications. The woman had been agitated, calling for her deceased husband, pulling at her IV lines. Olivia had stayed past the end of her shift to help settle her, talking softly in Spanish about Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, her grandchildren, anything that might bring her comfort. "I stayed with her because she was scared," Olivia said quietly. "She didn't have anyone else there. Her mother was at home recovering from hip surgery, and Sandra couldn't afford to miss work for what might turn out to be nothing. So I stayed with her until the test results came back clear. I gave her information about anxiety support groups. I followed up because that's what nurses do. We care." "I understand that," Brennan said, "but the prosecution has painted a different picture. They're saying you became fixated on these patients, that you couldn't handle it when they moved on with their lives without your involvement." The accusation was so foreign to Olivia's understanding of herself that she felt as though they were discussing a stranger. In her 12 years as a nurse, she had cared for thousands of patients. She remembered many of them, certainly. It was impossible to forget the teenager who'd survived a motorcycle accident against all odds, or the elderly woman who died peacefully, surrounded by 4 generations of her family, or the young father who'd beaten cancer and returned to the ICU 2 years later to show her photos of his daughter's first steps. But fixated? Obsessed? The words felt like accusations against her fundamental nature. "What about alibis?" she asked. "I was working when Marcus was killed. There are security cameras, time cards, patient charts I signed." Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The timeline is complicated. Marcus Williams was killed on a Tuesday night, but the coroner's report suggests the time of death could have been anywhere between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Your shift ended at 11 p.m. that night." Olivia's memory of that evening came back in fragments. She'd been caring for Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly diabetic who'd been admitted with complications. The woman had been agitated, calling for her deceased husband, pulling at her IV lines.
Olivia had stayed past the end of her shift to help settle her, talking softly in Spanish about Mrs. Rodriguez's garden, her grandchildren, anything that might bring her comfort. "I stayed in the hospital until after midnight. I was with Mrs. Rodriguez. She was having a difficult night." "Mrs. Rodriguez passed away 3 days later. The night shift nurse who relieved you said she was sleeping peacefully when she did her rounds at 11:30 p.m. There's no record of you staying late." The implication hung between them like smoke. Olivia tried to remember who else had been on the floor that night, who might have seen her in Mrs. Rodriguez's room. But the ICU at night was often understaffed, with nurses scattered across different wings, each managing multiple patients in various stages of crisis and recovery. "What about Sandra Martinez? I was at book club when she was killed." "The book club members confirm you were there from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Sandra was killed sometime between 9 p.m. and midnight." Brennan pulled out another document. Her apartment was only 15 minutes from Elena Vasquez's house. The methodical dismantling of her alibis felt like watching her life being erased one detail at a time. Olivia thought of Elena's living room, the circle of women discussing Gabriel Garcia Marquez's magical realism while sipping Elena's famous Café Cubano. They debated whether love could truly transcend death, whether the spiritual realm could intersect with the physical world in measurable ways. The irony was bitter. She was living in her own version of magical realism now, where the impossible had somehow become legally probable. "And James Thompson?" "Sunday morning, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. You were leading the children's choir, but practice didn't start until 9 a.m. James was killed between 7 and 8 a.m. Olivia always arrived early on Sundays. She liked the quiet sanctuary before the congregation arrived, the way sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows,
depicting the stations of the cross. She would sit in the front pew and review the songs she planned to teach the children, thinking about which ones might help little Maria Gonzalez come out of her shell, or give hyperactive Carlos Mendoza a chance to channel his energy into something beautiful. But arriving early meant arriving alone. Father Miguel didn't get to the church until 8:30 on Sundays, and the janitor who usually opened the building wouldn't remember whether she'd been there at 7 a.m. or 7:30 a.m. "They have a murder weapon?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. 3 different weapons: a .38 caliber revolver from Marcus Williams and Sandra Martinez, a .22 caliber pistol for James Thompson. Neither has been recovered, but ballistics show they were both used in other crimes in the Miami area over the past 2 years. This should have been encouraging news. Surely she had no connection to a gun involved in multiple crimes, but Brennan's expression suggested otherwise. "Olivia, both weapons were traced to firearms reported stolen from the homes of former patients at Jackson Memorial, patients who died while under your care." The room seemed to tilt. Olivia gripped the edge of the table, her nursing training automatically cataloging the symptoms she was experiencing: increased heart rate, shallow breathing, cold sweats, nausea. Classic signs of shock, the body's response to trauma too overwhelming to process normally. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Robert Chen died of complications from diabetes in 2001. His .38 caliber revolver was reported stolen from his apartment 2 weeks after his death. Jennifer Walsh died of cancer in 2002. Her husband's .22 caliber pistol went missing from their home sometime after the funeral." Brennan leaned forward. "Both families remember you being particularly supportive during their loved ones' final days. Both remember giving you their home addresses because you said you wanted to send condolence cards." The condolence cards. Olivia had written hundreds of them over the years, personal notes to families who had lost someone under her care. It was something she'd started doing early in her career after watching too many families leave the hospital carrying only grief and a plastic bag of personal belongings. The cards were simple:
A brief note acknowledging their loved one's courage, their family's devotion, her own sense of loss at their passing. She kept a box of elegant stationery in her bedroom closet specifically for this purpose. The paper was cream-colored with a subtle embossed border, expensive enough to convey respect but not so fancy as to seem inappropriate. She would sit at her kitchen table on Sunday evenings, writing each note by hand, sometimes including a pressed flower or a small prayer card from her grandmother's collection. I sent those families cards because I cared about their loss. I've sent hundreds of condolence cards over the years. That doesn't make me a thief. The prosecution is arguing that you used those visits to case their homes, to learn about valuables and security measures, that you returned later to steal items you knew would be emotionally significant to you. They're saying you took the weapons as trophies, then used them to kill other former patients when your psychological needs escalated. The theory was so bizarre, so fundamentally at odds with everything Olivia understood about herself that she almost laughed. Almost. But the evidence was real, documented, logged into police files and court records. Somewhere in this bureaucratic nightmare, her life as a compassionate nurse was being transformed into the profile of a serial killer. I need to call my supervisor at the hospital. Nancy Kim has known me for 8 years. She can tell you what kind of person I am. We tried to reach her. She's not returning our calls. The silence that followed felt heavier than the Miami humidity that pressed against the jail's windows. Outside, Olivia could hear the distant sound of traffic, the normal rhythm of a city going about its business while her world collapsed inward. That night, lying on the narrow cot in her cell, Olivia stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct her life from an outside perspective. What would someone see if they looked at her through the lens of suspicion rather than familiarity? An unmarried woman in her 30s
who had never sustained a long-term romantic relationship. A nurse who worked extra shifts and volunteered her free time rather than building a conventional social life. Someone who remembered the names of hundreds of former patients, who kept detailed notes about their personal struggles, who showed up at funerals for people she'd known only in their final days or weeks. When viewed through this distorted mirror, her compassion looked like obsession. Her dedication appeared pathological. Her genuine grief over patient deaths seemed like evidence of an unhealthy attachment to mortality itself. But that wasn't who she was it? The Miami Herald's front page on Thursday morning featured Olivia's booking photo alongside a headline that would define the next phase of her nightmare. Angel of Death, nurse charged in triple homicide. The reporter, Carmen Valdez, had managed to obtain quotes from hospital staff, neighbors, and former patients' families, weaving together a narrative that transformed 12 years of dedicated nursing into a pattern of predatory behavior. By Friday, the local television stations had picked up the story. Channel 7's Evening News led with dramatic footage of Olivia being transferred from the county jail to the courthouse, her hands cuffed behind her back, her head down as she navigated a gauntlet of cameras and shouted questions. The reporter's voiceover described her as a trusted healthcare professional who allegedly used her position to prey on vulnerable patients. At Jackson Memorial Hospital, Nancy Kim sat in her small supervisor's office and watched the coverage with a sick feeling in her stomach. She had worked alongside Olivia for 8 years, had watched her comfort dying patients, celebrate recovery milestones, and grieve losses that weren't even technically her responsibility. The woman being described on television bore no resemblance to the colleague who had stayed late to hold the hand of a frightened teenager, or who had learned Spanish phrases to better communicate with elderly patients. But Nancy's attempts to defend Olivia to the reporters who called had been met with skepticism, and the hospital administration had made it clear that employees should not speak to the media about the case. The official statement from Jackson Memorial was carefully neutral. We are cooperating fully with law enforcement and cannot comment on ongoing legal proceedings. Detective Rodriguez understood the media attention was both helping and hurting the case. Public pressure always made prosecutors more aggressive, more willing to push forward with charges that might otherwise be considered borderline. But it also meant that every piece of evidence would be scrutinized, every procedural detail examined for flaws that defense attorneys could exploit. He stood in the evidence room looking at the items seized from Olivia's house, trying to see them through the eyes of a jury. Her grandmother's prayer book was filled with handwritten notes, but most were in Spanish and seemed to be religious reflections rather than anything sinister. A box of condolence cards in her closet contained drafts of notes to families, but the language was consistently compassionate and appropriate. The most damaging piece of evidence was a small address book found in her kitchen drawer. It contained names, addresses, and phone numbers for dozens of former patients, along with detailed notes about their conditions, family situations, and personal histories. To Rodriguez, it looked like the careful records of someone who genuinely cared about the people she'd treated. To the prosecutor, it would look like a predator's hunting manual. She kept track of everyone, Detective Martinez said, reading over Rodriguez's shoulder. Look at this. Marcus Williams, apartment 3B, lives alone, sister visits on weekends. Sandra Martinez, works 2 jobs, mother has mobility issues. James Thompson, diabetic, financial problems, lives with sister who works nights. Or she was a nurse who cared enough to remember important details about her patients. My wife's a teacher. She keeps notes about her students' home situations, their struggles, their victories. Doesn't make her a predator. Martinez looked at his partner with surprise. It wasn't like Rodriguez to express doubt once an arrest had been made. You having second thoughts? I'm having all kinds of thoughts, Rodriguez said. This case has been bothering me since day one. The timeline issues, the lack of physical evidence, the complete absence of motive. 3 different murder weapons, 3 different locations, 3 different methods. It doesn't fit any serial killer profile I've ever studied.
Maybe she's not a serial killer, Martinez suggested. Maybe she's just a nurse who snapped. Maybe the stress of watching people die every day finally got to her, and she decided to take control, play God in a different way. It was a theory that had been floated by the FBI consultant brought in to review the case. Olivia Taylor fit a certain profile of healthcare workers who had committed crimes against patients. Highly skilled, deeply involved in patient care, often unmarried and without strong social connections outside of work. The consultant had pointed to cases like Charles Cullen, the nurse who had killed dozens of patients across multiple hospitals, or Dorothea Puente, who had murdered elderly boarders in her care. But those cases involved victims who were under the perpetrator's direct care, who died from medical interventions or neglect. Olivia's alleged victims had been killed with firearms in their own homes or vehicles after they had recovered and left her care. The inconsistencies bothered Rodriguez, but the evidence was compelling enough that the district attorney had decided to move forward. Patricia Gonzalez was a prosecutor with political ambitions and a reputation for taking difficult cases to trial. She saw the Olivia Taylor case as an opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to justice while building name recognition for a potential run for Attorney General. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Gonzalez practiced in her office, addressing an imaginary panel. Olivia Taylor was trusted with the most vulnerable members of our community, patients who came to her in pain, in fear, seeking healing and comfort. She took that trust and perverted it, using her position to identify victims who were isolated, vulnerable, and unlikely to be missed immediately. Her assistant, Michael Chen, no relation to the patient whose gun was allegedly stolen, reviewed the witness list. We've got strong testimony from the firearms owners' families. Both remember giving Olivia their addresses. Both had break-ins shortly after their loved ones died. The timeline works. What about the hospital staff? Anyone willing to testify about unusual behavior? Chen hesitated. It's complicated. Most of her colleagues speak highly of her. but there are a few who mentioned concerns. Dr. Sarah Blackwell said Olivia sometimes seemed overly invested in patient outcomes. Nurse Jennifer Park mentioned that Olivia would get intensity-focused on certain patients, especially those who were dying alone. Intensity-focused, Gonzalez repeated. I like that phrase. It suggests obsession without sounding too clinical. The prosecution's strategy was taking shape. Portray Olivia as a nurse whose compassion had curdled into something darker, whose need to control life and death had eventually led her to kill the very people she had once saved. The stolen weapons would be presented as trophies, physical links to patients whose deaths had affected her deeply. The murders themselves would be characterized as the final stage of a psychological breakdown that had been building for years. Meanwhile, David Brennan was struggling to build a coherent defense. His client maintained her innocence with a consistency that was either deeply convincing or evidence of severe psychological detachment. She could account for her whereabouts during the approximate times of the murders, but none of her alibis were airtight. More problematically, she couldn't explain how the stolen weapons connected to her former patients had ended up being used in the crimes. We need to find another suspect, Brennan told his investigator, a retired Miami police detective named Luis Herrera. Someone with access to information about the victims, someone who knew about their connection to Olivia. Herrera had been reviewing the case files for a week, and he was beginning to share Rodriguez's doubts. The problem is that all three victims were living relatively normal lives when they were killed. No drug connections, no gambling debts, no obvious enemies. If this isn't random violence, then someone specifically targeted people who had been patients at Jackson Memorial. Someone other than Olivia. Maybe, or maybe Olivia is telling the truth, but someone wanted it to look like she was involved. Herrera pulled out crime scene photos. Look at these locations. Marcus Williams was killed in his apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry. Sandra Martinez was found in her car, but she had defensive wounds on her hands. James Thompson was attacked outside his building, but his wallet and keys were untouched. The pattern suggested victims who had known their attacker, or at least hadn't been immediately afraid. All three had allowed their killer to get close enough to use a firearm at relatively close range. None had been sexually assaulted or robbed in any conventional sense.
What if someone was specifically targeting Olivia? Brennan asked. What if these murders were committed to frame her? It was a theory that would require proving not just that Olivia was innocent, but that someone else was guilty and had carefully constructed evidence to implicate her. In Miami in 2003, with limited DNA analysis and before the widespread use of cell phone tracking, proving such an elaborate frame job would be nearly impossible. But as the weeks passed and the case moved toward trial, strange details began to emerge. The first came from Marcus Williams' sister, who mentioned during a follow-up interview that her brother had received several phone calls in the weeks before his death from someone claiming to be conducting a follow-up survey for Jackson Memorial Hospital. He said it was some kind of quality assurance thing, she told Detective Martinez. Someone asking about his experience as a patient, whether he was satisfied with his care, whether he had any ongoing health concerns. Marcus thought it was nice that they cared enough to check up on him. Sandra Martinez's mother reported similar phone calls. A woman with a very professional voice, claiming to be from the hospital. She asked about Sandra's job schedule, whether she was still having anxiety problems, whether she felt safe living alone. I thought it was strange, but Sandra said maybe it was normal for them to follow up. James Thompson's sister had also received calls, though she'd been suspicious enough to hang up after the first one. The woman claimed to be a nurse doing a follow-up study, but something about her voice didn't sound right. Too smooth, too rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. When Detective Rodriguez tried to trace these calls through Jackson Memorial's administration, he hit a wall. The hospital had no record of any quality assurance surveys being conducted during the relevant time period. No follow-up calls to former patients were scheduled or authorized. The calls had apparently been made by someone impersonating hospital staff to gather information about the eventual victims. This changes everything, Rodriguez told Martinez. If someone was systematically gathering information about these patients using Olivia's name or position at the hospital, then we're looking at a completely different crime. But the evidence against Olivia was already too substantial to dismiss easily. The stolen weapons, her presence in all three victims' medical histories, her detailed notes about their personal lives, it all painted a compelling picture of guilt that would be difficult to overcome without identifying an alternative suspect. The media coverage intensified as the trial date approached. Channel 23 ran a special report titled "Trust Betrayed: Healthcare Workers Who Kill," featuring interviews with criminologists and former patients who had been treated by Olivia. Most spoke positively about their experiences, but the editings of the program emphasized moments of hesitation, uncertain expressions, and comments that could be interpreted as suggesting unusual intensity in her patient interactions. Elena Vasquez, the woman who had hosted the book club where Olivia was allegedly present during Sandra Martinez's murder, found herself questioned repeatedly by reporters about the exact timing of that evening's discussion. "I keep thinking about whether she seemed nervous that night, but I can't separate what I actually remember from what I think I should remember now." The psychological pressure on potential witnesses was intense. People who had known Olivia for years began to question their own perceptions, wondering if signs of dangerous behavior had been present all along, but dismissed or rationalized. The very qualities that had made her an excellent nurse, her attention to detail, her emotional investment in patient care, her willingness to go beyond normal job requirements, were being reframed as evidence of psychological instability. Father Miguel from St. Agnes Church received multiple requests for interviews, but refused to speak to reporters. Instead, he organized prayer vigils for both Olivia and the families of the murder victims, struggling to maintain his congregation's faith in both divine justice and human redemption. The vigils were poorly attended, as parishioners found themselves caught between loyalty to someone they had known and trusted for years and the disturbing possibility that their trust had been misplaced.
In her cell at the Miami-Dade County Jail, Olivia tried to maintain her daily routines as much as possible. She woke at 5 a.m., the same time she had awakened for 12 years to prepare for hospital shifts. She exercised in the small space available, doing modified versions of the yoga poses she had learned to help manage the stress of nursing. She wrote letters to her mother that she never sent, unwilling to burden an elderly woman with a crisis she couldn't understand or resolve. But the isolation was becoming unbearable. The other inmates either avoided her entirely, disturbed by the nature of the charges against her, or approached her with a mixture of curiosity and hostility that made every interaction feel dangerous. "You really kill those people?" asked Carmen Rodriguez, a woman awaiting trial on drug charges who'd been assigned to the same cell block. Her voice carried no judgment, only a professional interest in understanding another criminal's methodology. "I didn't kill anyone," Olivia replied for the 100th time since her arrest. Carmen studied her with the calculating gaze of someone who had learned to assess threats quickly. "Cops got enough evidence to charge you, though. That's something." The conversations always ended the same way, with Olivia's protestations of innocence meeting skeptical silence. Even among people who had committed various crimes themselves, the idea of a healthcare worker killing patients seemed particularly heinous. She found herself more isolated in jail than she had ever been in the outside world. The trial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Brennan had filed numerous motions challenging the evidence, but Judge Patricia Morales had denied most of them. The stolen weapons were admissible, despite the circumstantial nature of the connection. Olivia's patient notes were admissible, despite their apparent medical legitimacy. The testimony about her unusual intensity with certain patients would be allowed, despite its subjective nature. "The deck is stacked against us," Brennan admitted during one of their meetings. "Gonzalez has built a compelling narrative, and juries love narratives. We need something concrete to challenge their version of events." Luis Herrera had been working tirelessly to find that concrete evidence. He'd re-interviewed friends and family members of all 3 victims, looking for connections that hadn't been explored by the police.
He'd reviewed security footage from the hospital during Olivia's shifts, trying to establish more precise timelines for her whereabouts. He'd even hired a private investigator to look into the backgrounds of other Jackson Memorial employees who might have had access to patient information. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh's widower, Robert, contacted Ed after seeing a news report about the case. "I've been thinking about those phone calls my wife got before she died, the woman who claimed to be doing a follow-up survey. Something about her voice has been bothering me." "What about it?" "I heard that voice somewhere else, more recently." Robert Walsh was a careful man, a retired accountant who had spent his career paying attention to details others might miss. "It was at the funeral home when we were making arrangements for Jennifer. One of the staff members there, she had the exact same voice, the same accent, the same way of speaking." Edda's pulse quickened. "Do you remember the name of the funeral home?" "Eternal Rest Funeral Services on Coral Way. The woman's name was Teresa something. Teresa Martinez." A funeral home employee would have access to obituaries before they were published, would know about families dealing with recent losses, would understand the emotional vulnerability that comes with grief. Someone in that position might have learned about the connection between certain deceased patients and their nurse at Jackson Memorial. Edda drove to Eternal Rest Funeral Services that afternoon. The building was a converted Victorian mansion painted in soothing pastels, surrounded by manicured gardens that suggested peace and comfort. The staff was uniformly professional, dressed in dark suits and speaking in the measured tones appropriate for their profession. Teresa Martinez was in her early 40s, an attractive woman with prematurely silver hair and intelligent dark eyes. She had worked at Eternal Rest for 6 years, handling everything from initial family consultations to coordinating with cemeteries and florists. Her colleagues described her as dedicated, compassionate, and particularly gifted at helping families navigate their grief.
"I remember the Walsh family," she said, when Herrera introduced himself and explained his purpose. "Mrs. Walsh was such a lovely woman. Cancer, wasn't it? So tragic when it happens to someone so young." "Did you have occasion to contact the family after the services?" Teresa's expression remained perfectly composed, but Herrera noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. "Contact them how? Phone calls? Follow-up surveys? Checking on their emotional well-being?" "Oh no, we don't do that kind of follow-up. Families need space to grieve. We're available if they need us, but we don't intrude." It was a reasonable policy, but Herrera had learned to pay attention to the subtle signs that indicated deception. Teresa's body language had shifted slightly. Her hands were now clasped in front of her, her posture more rigid, her breathing slightly shallower. "What about Robert Chen's family? Did you handle those arrangements as well?" "The name sounds familiar. We handle many families, though." Herrera pulled out a small notebook, flipping through pages as though checking facts. "Robert Chen died in 2001 from diabetes complications. His family reported receiving follow-up calls from someone claiming to represent Jackson Memorial Hospital." "I wouldn't know anything about that." But Teresa Martinez was now visibly uncomfortable. Her voice had taken on a different quality, more formal, more controlled, the same quality that Robert Walsh had noticed and remembered. "Miss Martinez, where were you on the evening of March 15th? That was the date of Marcus Williams' murder." "I couldn't possibly remember. That was weeks ago." "How about March 22nd, Sandra Martinez's death?" "I really don't keep track of my personal schedule that precisely." "March 30th? Teresa stood up abruptly. "I think you should speak with my supervisor if you have questions about our business practices. I don't have to answer personal questions without a lawyer present." The interview was over, but Herrera had heard enough. Teresa Martinez shared a surname with one of the victims, possibly a coincidence, but worth investigating. More importantly, her voice matched Robert Walsh's description, and her evasive responses suggested knowledge of the crimes that went beyond what had been reported in the media.
Within 48 hours, Herrera had uncovered Teresa Martinez's background. She had worked at Jackson Memorial from 1998 to 2001 as a patient services coordinator, a position that gave her access to patient records and discharge information. She had left under circumstances that were officially described as voluntary resignation, but had apparently involved concerns about her interactions with grieving families. "She was too intense," said Dr. Williams, the former administrator who had handled her departure. "She would call families after patients died, ostensibly to offer condolences, but some complained that she was asking inappropriate questions about inheritance, life insurance, personal belongings. We tried to counsel her about boundaries, but the behavior continued." Teresa had been particularly interested in patients who died without extensive family support, who lived alone or had limited social connections. Patients like Marcus Williams, Sandra Martinez, and James Thompson.
Her employment at Eternal Rest Funeral Services had given her continued access to information about recent deaths, along with the professional credibility to contact families without raising immediate suspicion. She had been in the perfect position to identify former Jackson Memorial patients who fit a certain profile and to gather information about their post-discharge lives. But access to information wasn't the same as committing murder, and Herrera knew that proving Teresa's involvement would require much more than suspicious behavior and circumstantial connections. The breakthrough came when he discovered that Teresa Martinez owned a storage unit in a facility near the airport. The unit was rented under her maiden name, Castillo, and had been paid for in cash for the past 2 years. When Miami police obtained a search warrant for the unit, they found a collection that chilled even experienced detectives. The storage unit contained detailed files on dozens of former Jackson Memorial patients who had died over the past 5 years. Each file included copies of medical records, obituaries, family contact information, and handwritten notes about the patient's final days and their interactions with hospital staff. Many files contained photographs, apparently taken without the subject's knowledge, patients in their hospital beds, families in waiting rooms, nurses providing care. At the center of this collection were 3 thick folders labeled Priority Cases. They contained extensive surveillance notes on Marcus Williams, Sandra Martinez, and James Thompson, including their daily routines, work schedules, and living situations. The notes were written in Teresa's distinctive handwriting and dated from several weeks before each murder. But most damning of all was a folder labeled OT, Olivia Taylor. This folder contained hundreds of photographs of Olivia at work, at home, at church, and in various locations around Miami. There were copies of her personnel file, her nursing license, her vehicle registration, and her credit report. There were detailed notes about her routines, her relationships, her volunteer activities, and her interactions with specific patients. The folder also contained drafts of letters never sent, rambling, obsessive screeds accusing Olivia of stealing Teresa's rightful place in patients' hearts, of receiving credit for compassion that Teresa believed she possessed more authentically. "She thinks she's so perfect," one letter read, standing there in her scrubs like some kind of angel, taking all the gratitude that should belong to someone who really understands death. "She doesn't know what it's like to lose everything, to have your whole life destroyed by other people's selfishness, but she's going to learn." The final entry in the folder was dated 2 weeks before Marcus Williams' murder. "She took my patience, my identity, my future. Now she's going to lose hers. When they find her precious patients dead, when they see the weapons from the families she pretended to care about, everyone will know what she really is. Everyone will see that I was the one who truly understood them." Detective Rodriguez stared at the evidence spread across the conference table in the Miami-Dade Police Department. "Jesus Christ," he said quietly. "This woman spent 3 years planning to frame Olivia Taylor for murders she was going to commit herself." Teresa Martinez was arrested at her apartment that evening.
She offered no resistance, seemed almost relieved that her elaborate plan had finally reached its conclusion. During questioning, she confessed to the murders with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized her surveillance work. She had stolen the weapons from the homes of deceased patients during funeral arrangements, using her professional access to identify opportunities. She had contacted Marcus Williams, Teresa Martinez, and James Thompson using information gathered during their hospital stays, convincing each of them to meet her by claiming she was conducting follow-up research for their former nurse. Olivia Taylor destroyed my career, she told the detectives. She was everything the hospital wanted in a nurse: young, pretty, naturally compassionate. They pushed me out to make room for people like her. But I understood death better than she ever could. I had lived with it, breathed it, been shaped by it. She was just playing at caring. The confession was videotaped and legally admissible. Within hours, the charges against Olivia Taylor were dropped, and she was released from jail after 7 weeks of incarceration. The fluorescent lights in the Miami-Dade County Jail buzzed with their familiar electrical hum as Olivia Taylor signed her release papers at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in May 2003. Her hands shook slightly as she wrote her signature, muscle memory struggling to reconcile the act of writing her own name with the freedom it suddenly represented. 7 weeks of captivity had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand.
Detective Rodriguez stood beside the processing desk, holding a manila envelope containing the personal items that had been taken from her on the night of her arrest. Her grandmother's silver cross felt heavier than she remembered when he placed it in her palm. The metal was cold, but she could still see Abuela Carmen's weathered fingers polishing it every Sunday morning before Mass. "Miss Taylor," Rodriguez said quietly, "I want to apologize. Not just on behalf of the department, but personally. We got this wrong, and you paid the price for our mistake." Olivia looked up at him, this man who had read her rights 7 weeks ago and now stood before her with genuine remorse etched in the lines around his eyes. "You were doing your job," she said. "The evidence looked convincing." "The evidence was manufactured. That's different than making an honest mistake." He handed her a card with his personal phone number. "If you need anything, if there are problems with media, if people give you trouble, anything, you call me directly." The automatic doors of the jail slid open, and Olivia stepped into the Miami morning. The air was thick with humidity and the promise of afternoon thunderstorms, but it felt like freedom itself against her skin. David Brennan was waiting beside his car, along with Father Miguel and Nancy Kim from the hospital. Nancy's eyes were red with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "Olivia, honey, I'm so sorry. I should have fought harder, should have spoken up more." "You couldn't have changed anything," Olivia interrupted, allowing herself to be pulled into a hug that smelled of hospital disinfectant and the vanilla perfume Nancy had worn for as long as they'd worked together. Teresa had this planned too carefully. The ride back to her house in Little Havana was surreal. Streets she had driven down thousands of times looked different after 7 weeks of seeing only jail walls and transport vehicles. Her neighborhood seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, as though her arrest had revealed the thin membrane between safety and chaos that underlied all their daily routines. Her blue bungalow sat exactly as she had left it, except for the yellow police tape that had been removed and the small garden that Mrs. Chen had been maintaining in her absence. Tomatoes were beginning to ripen on the plants she'd started in February, and the jasmine vine her grandmother had planted 20 years ago was blooming with white flowers that perfumed the entire front yard. Inside, everything was precisely as the police had left it after their search. Books remained open to pages they had been examining for hidden messages. Drawers hung at odd angles where they had been hastily closed after being emptied. Her bedroom looked like it had been hit by a hurricane, with clothes scattered and furniture moved away from walls. But it was still her home. The photographs of her nursing school graduation still hung in the hallway. Her grandmother's dishes still filled the kitchen cabinets. The comfortable chair where she had read hundreds of books still sat by the window that overlooked her small backyard. Nancy had prepared a bag of groceries and left it on the kitchen counter. "I didn't know what you'd want to eat after. I just got basics," she said, her voice trailing off as she struggled with the impossibility of resuming normal conversation after such an extraordinary circumstance. Father Miguel blessed the house in Spanish, sprinkling holy water in each room and asking God to cleanse it of the trauma that had originated there. It was a ritual that might have seemed superstitious to some, but to Olivia it felt necessary, a way of reclaiming space that had been violated by the search, by the assumption of guilt, by the presence of strangers who had touched her possessions while believing her capable of murder. The first phone call came at 8:15 a.m. A reporter from Channel 7 who had somehow obtained her home number despite it being unlisted. Then another from the Miami Herald. Then another from a radio station. Brennan had warned her this would happen, but the reality of having her private life become public entertainment was overwhelming. "Miss Taylor, how does it feel to be free? Do you plan to sue the city for wrongful arrest? What was it like knowing someone was trying to frame you for murder?" She unplugged the phone after the sixth call. By noon, there were satellite trucks parked on both ends of her street. Neighbors who had known her for 15 years suddenly found themselves being interviewed about their memories of the woman they had watched being arrested 7 weeks earlier. Most defended her, but their quotes were edited in ways that emphasized uncertainty rather than support. "She was always very quiet," said Mr. Fernandez from the bodega. His words chosen carefully in English, he spoke less comfortably than Spanish. "Good neighbor, you know, but quiet." On television, his hesitation was presented as suspicion, his linguistic caution as evidence of hidden doubts about her character. Elena Vasquez from the book club found herself defending not only Olivia but the very concept of presumed innocence. "People in this neighborhood, we know each other," she told a reporter who seemed more interested in drama than accuracy. "Olivia Taylor is a good woman who was caught up in something terrible. But instead of asking how we can support her, you want us to gossip about whether we suspected something. That says more about you than it does about her." The revelation of Teresa Martinez's elaborate frame-up had created its own media sensation. Criminologists and psychologists were analyzing the case on cable news programs, discussing the psychological profile of someone capable of such a complex deception. The storage unit photographs were particularly disturbing to media commentators who struggled to understand the depth of obsession they represented. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Miami, appeared on multiple programs to explain Teresa's likely motivations. This appears to be a case of what we call injustice collecting, the gradual accumulation of perceived slights and unfairnesses until they reach a critical mass that triggers vengeful behavior. Ms. Martinez believed she had been wrongfully treated by the hospital, and she focused her resentment on someone she saw as having received what she deserved. But the psychological analysis, however accurate, did little to address the practical reality of Olivia's situation. She had been publicly accused of triple murder, arrested in front of her neighbors, and subjected to weeks of media coverage that portrayed her as a healthcare worker who had betrayed the fundamental trust of her profession. The fact that she had been proven innocent was, in some ways, a separate story from the initial accusations. People who had followed the case closely understood she had been framed by a disturbed former colleague, but many others retained only a vague memory of a nurse in Miami who had been arrested for killing patients. The resolution of the case had received less attention than the initial sensational charges. At Jackson Memorial Hospital, the administration was struggling with its own crisis of confidence. The revelation that a former employee had spent years planning to frame a current staff member raised serious questions about hiring practices, background checks, and employee mental health monitoring. The hospital's legal department was also preparing for potential lawsuits from the families of patients whose private medical information had been compromised by Teresa's surveillance activities. Dr. Patricia Valdez, a forensic psychiatrist at the University of Miami, appeared on multiple programs to explain Teresa's likely motivations. This appears to be a case of what we call injustice collecting, the gradual accumulation of perceived slights and unfairnesses until they reach a critical mass that triggers vengeful behavior.
Ms. Martinez believed she had been wrongfully treated by the hospital, and she focused her resentment on someone she saw as having received what she deserved. But the psychological analysis, however accurate, did little to address the practical reality of Olivia's situation. She had been publicly accused of triple murder, arrested in front of her neighbors, and subjected to weeks of media coverage that portrayed her as a healthcare worker who had betrayed the fundamental trust of her profession. The fact that she had been proven innocent was, in some ways, a separate story from the initial accusations. People who had followed the case closely understood she had been framed by a disturbed former colleague, but many others retained only a vague memory of a nurse in Miami who had been arrested for killing patients. The resolution of the case had received less attention than the initial sensational charges. Jennifer Park, the nurse who had mentioned Olivia's intensity focus on certain patients, visited Olivia's house on her third day home. She came bearing a casserole and a handwritten letter that she had spent hours composing. "I want to explain what I meant when I talked to the police," she said, standing on Olivia's front porch while news crews filmed from across the street. "When I said you got focused on certain patients, I meant it as a good thing. You would spend your own time researching their conditions, learning about their families, finding resources to help them. But when the detective asked about it, I could tell he was hearing something different than what I was saying." They sat in Olivia's kitchen, the blinds drawn against the cameras outside, and talked about the impossible position that healthcare workers faced when trying to balance professional detachment with human compassion. Jennifer had been struggling with her own guilt, wondering if her words had contributed to an innocent woman's imprisonment. "The detective kept asking if your behavior ever seemed strange or inappropriate," Jennifer said, "and I kept saying no, but he would ask the same question different ways, like he was waiting for me to remember something that wasn't there. Finally, I mentioned that you sometimes seemed more emotionally invested in certain cases than other nurses, but I meant it as a compliment." "I know," Olivia said. "You weren't the only one. The prosecution took normal observations and twisted them into evidence of mental illness. That's not your fault." But Jennifer's visit highlighted one of the most difficult aspects of Olivia's situation. The people who knew her best had been asked to participate in building a case against her. Their honest observations about her character had been taken out of context and used to support a narrative that portrayed her dedication as pathology. The families of Teresa Martinez's victims were dealing with their own complex emotions about the case. Marcus Williams' sister had initially found some comfort in believing that his killer had been caught and would face justice. Learning that the person arrested was innocent, while the real killer had been manipulating the investigation from the beginning, was almost harder to process than the original crime. "At least when we thought it was the nurse, there was a reason," she told Detective Rodriguez. "It was horrible, but we could understand why someone who worked with dying people might snap. But this other woman, she killed my brother just to hurt someone else. Marcus was just a tool in her revenge against this nurse he'd never even met." Sandra Martinez's mother struggled with guilt about the follow-up phone calls she had received from Teresa. "I gave that woman information about my daughter's work schedule, her living situation. I thought I was helping with some kind of medical study. I helped his killer find her." James Thompson's sister was angry, not just at Teresa Martinez, but at the entire system that had allowed an innocent woman to be imprisoned while the real killer moved freely through society. How many more people might she have killed if she hadn't been caught? How many other patients was she watching, planning to hurt just to frame someone else? The psychological evaluation of Teresa Martinez revealed a woman who had been consumed by resentment for years before committing her crimes. Her journals, discovered in her apartment, traced a gradual progression from professional disappointment to obsessive jealousy to careful planning for revenge. She had spent months studying Olivia's routines, documenting her interactions with patients, and identifying former patients who could serve as both victims and evidence in her frame-up. "She saw herself as the true victim in this situation," explained Dr. Valdez in her analysis. From her perspective, Olivia Taylor had stolen the career that rightfully belonged to her. The murders weren't just crimes, they were acts of justice in her distorted worldview. But understanding Teresa's psychological motivations did little to help the people whose lives had been shattered by her actions. 3 families had lost loved ones to a killer who saw them as expendable tools in a larger revenge fantasy. One woman had lost 7 weeks of her freedom and the reputation she had built over 12 years of dedicated service. An entire community had been forced to question their assumptions about the people they trusted with their health care. The media attention began to shift as news stories emerged and public interest moved on to other crises and sensations. But for the people directly affected by Teresa Martinez's crimes, the impact would continue long after the cameras disappeared and the satellite trucks moved on to other neighborhoods. On her first Sunday home, Olivia sat in the back pew of St. Agnes Church during the 8 a.m. Mass. She had arrived early, hoping to avoid the crowds and the inevitable stares of people who were still processing the transformation from accused killer back to trusted community member. Father Miguel had announced her vindication from the pulpit the previous Sunday, but she knew that public perception would take longer to change than legal status. The children's choir sang Amazing Grace during communion, their young voices pure and clear in the acoustic space of the sanctuary. Olivia closed her eyes and listened to the words she had taught many of these children over the years. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. The hymn felt like a prayer for her own situation, lost in a nightmare of false accusations, now found in the truth of her innocence. But she also recognized that the process of truly seeing, of understanding what had happened and why, was still ongoing for everyone involved. When the service ended, several parishioners approached her with hugs, apologies, and expressions of support that felt genuine but carried undertones of awkwardness. These were people who had known her for years, who had never doubted her innocence, but who were still processing the shock of learning that someone could plan such an elaborate deception. "We never believed it," said Carmen Therese, whose daughter Olivia had tutored in algebra. "Not for 1 minute. We knew there had to be some mistake." But Olivia could see in Carmen's eyes the same uncertainty she saw in many faces, not doubt about her innocence, but a new awareness of how fragile the assumptions of daily life could be. If a trusted nurse could be framed for murder by a former colleague no one remembered, what other dangers might be hiding behind familiar faces and reassuring professional credentials? The return to normal life was complicated by practical considerations that she hadn't anticipated. Her nursing license had been suspended during her incarceration, and while it could now be reinstated, the process would take weeks of paperwork and review. Her health insurance had lapsed, her car registration had expired, and her credit cards had been canceled for non-payment while she was in jail. Most challenging of all was the question of whether she could return to work at Jackson Memorial Hospital. The administration had made supportive public statements about her vindication, but she knew that having her back on the ICU floor would create complications for everyone involved. Patients and families who remembered the media coverage might request different nurses. Colleagues who had been questioned about her behavior might feel uncomfortable working alongside her. The very presence of someone who had been so publicly associated with patient murders, even falsely, could undermine the atmosphere of trust and safety that was essential to effective healthcare. Nancy Kim addressed this concern during a private meeting in her office on Olivia's first week home. "Your job is here if you want it," she said firmly. "We've had some conversations with HR and administration, and everyone agrees that you belong here. But we also understand if you need time to decide whether this is where you want to be." Olivia looked around the small office where she had received performance evaluations, discussed difficult cases, and celebrated professional milestones. This place had been the center of her professional identity for 12 years. "I don't know who I am if I'm not a nurse," she said quietly. "But I also don't know if I can walk into that ICU and not think about Teresa Martinez taking photographs of me while I worked. She watched me with those patients, documented my interactions, planned how to use my compassion against me. How do I trust that feeling of being watched isn't going to paralyze me?" It was a conversation that would continue over the coming weeks and months as Olivia tried to rebuild not just her external life, but her internal sense of safety and purpose. The trauma of false accusation had layers that were only beginning to reveal themselves. The violation of privacy, the distortion of her professional identity, the realization that someone had studied her life so closely while planning to destroy it.
6 months after her release from false imprisonment for murders she didn't commit, Olivia Taylor stood before the Miami-Dade County Commission to advocate for criminal justice reforms. This moment marked the beginning of a 30-year journey that would transform personal trauma into systemic change, affecting healthcare advocacy and wrongful conviction prevention across the United States. Olivia's initial attempt to return to her nursing career at Jackson Memorial Hospital lasted only 3 shifts. While caring for an elderly surgical patient, she experienced what she described as the dissolution of professional identity, seeing herself through her false accuser's eyes as a target rather than a caregiver. The resulting panic attack in a supply closet, witnessed by colleague Nancy Kim, led to a 6-month medical leave that Olivia initially viewed as professional failure. Under the care of Dr. Carmen Gonzalez, a therapist specializing in healthcare worker trauma, Olivia began to understand her reaction as a normal response to extraordinary violation. Teresa Martinez, the real serial killer who had framed her, hadn't just attempted murder charges, she had invaded Olivia's professional identity by studying her genuine compassion and planning to weaponize it as evidence of guilt. The therapy process required confronting not only imprisonment trauma, but the deeper violation of having her authentic care for patients turned against her. Olivia had to learn to separate her desire to help people from the fear that caring would make her vulnerable to future attacks. During her healing period, Olivia discovered an unexpected calling in advocating for falsely accused healthcare workers. Her case had attracted national attention from nursing organizations facing similar situations where dedicated professionals were accused based on circumstantial evidence or misinterpreted actions. At the American Nurses Association's annual conference in Chicago, she addressed 3,000 nurses about supporting colleagues facing false accusations. Her speech, later published in professional journals, challenged the healthcare community to examine their readiness to believe accusations against their own colleagues without proper investigation. 8 months after her release, Olivia received a call from Sarah Williams, sister of Marcus Williams, one of the murder victims she'd been falsely accused of killing. Rather than seeking revenge or expressing anger, Sarah proposed establishing the Marcus Williams Memorial Fund to provide free healthcare advocacy services to uninsured and underinsured patients in Miami. This opportunity offered Olivia a way to return to patient advocacy without the institutional triggers of hospital employment. As the program's director, she would help individuals navigate healthcare systems, accompany them to medical appointments, assist with insurance bureaucracies, and connect them with community resources. Elena Martinez, a 60-year-old diabetic working 2 part-time jobs without insurance, became the fund's first client. Avoiding medical care due to costs, her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Olivia spent 3 weeks helping Elena access prescription assistance programs, locate free clinics, and develop management strategies. When Elena finally afforded her medications and said, "You saved my life," Olivia realized the profound satisfaction of comprehensive patient advocacy. Within a year, the Marcus Williams Memorial Fund had helped over 200 people navigate otherwise insurmountable healthcare challenges. The program's success attracted national attention, leading to consultation requests from other cities interested in replicating the model. Media coverage began shifting from sensational stories about the nurse falsely accused of murder to profiles of the advocate who turned personal trauma into community service. This transformation of public identity represented a crucial milestone in Olivia's recovery and professional evolution. In a remarkable act of courage, Olivia agreed to meet Teresa Martinez in prison. Teresa, serving 3 consecutive life sentences at Broward Correctional Institution, had requested the meeting through her attorney.
In the institutional green visiting room, Teresa offered not an apology but an explanation that provided Olivia with crucial understanding.
Teresa revealed that she had targeted Olivia specifically because of her authentic compassion, qualities Teresa could only perform rather than feel. She had studied Olivia's work for 3 years, documenting every kindness, every moment of genuine care, resenting the authenticity that exposed the emptiness of her own emotional responses. Most disturbingly, Teresa explained how she had used Olivia's reputation for caring to lure victims to their deaths, telling them Olivia had asked her to check on them. This revelation was both horrifying and strangely validating, confirming that Olivia's professional reputation had been built on genuine compassion that patients and families trusted completely. 2 years after her release, the Miami-Dade Police Department invited Olivia to help develop training programs for detectives investigating healthcare-related crimes. The program, funded by federal grants focused on preventing wrongful convictions, taught investigators to distinguish between concerning patterns and normal variations in healthcare worker behavior. Detective Rodriguez, who had originally arrested Olivia, acknowledged the lessons learned. Intensive patient care could appear obsessive without proper context. Detailed record-keeping could seem like predatory surveillance without understanding nursing practices. And investigators needed to recognize when evidence might have been planted or manipulated. The training program Olivia helped develop became a model for police departments nationwide, informally known as the Taylor Protocols among law enforcement professionals. These guidelines required consultation with healthcare professionals and psychological experts before arrests could be made in patient harm cases. The protocols were credited with preventing at least 12 wrongful convictions of healthcare workers across the country, representing one of the most tangible measures of how Olivia's experience prevented similar injustices. Olivia's relationship with David Brennan, the public defender who had represented her, evolved from professional collaboration to personal partnership. Both understood the specific trauma of false accusation and wrongful imprisonment, creating a foundation of mutual understanding and shared commitment to criminal justice reform. David left his public defender position to establish a private practice representing falsely accused healthcare workers, creating what colleagues called a dream team. His legal expertise, combined with her insider knowledge of healthcare culture and investigative procedures, their 2005 wedding at St. Agnes Church was celebrated by the community that had supported them both, with Detective Rodriguez walking Olivia down the aisle and the children's choir she once led providing music. The event symbolized not just personal happiness, but community healing and the triumph of truth over falsification. Olivia's expertise evolved beyond wrongful conviction consultation to broader healthcare policy analysis. She testified before congressional committees about protecting healthcare workers from false accusations while ensuring proper oversight systems to identify genuinely dangerous medical professionals. Her nuanced understanding of both victim protection and patient safety helped shape federal guidelines for investigating healthcare-related crimes. These guidelines required medical professional consultation and psychological expert analysis before arrests could be made, representing a systematic approach to preventing the type of rushed judgment that had nearly destroyed her life. 5 years after her arrest, the Marcus Williams Healthcare Advocacy Center had become a model for similar organizations nationwide. Federal agencies studying healthcare access disparities regularly cited the center's innovative approaches. Medical schools sent students for healthcare advocacy internships, expanding the concept beyond clinical medicine to social justice. The birth of Olivia's daughter, Carmen Elena, in 2013, 10 years after her arrest, represented a profound milestone.
Named for her grandmother and Elena Vasquez from the Supportive Book Club, Carmen would grow up in a world shaped by her mother's experience, but defined by positive changes that emerged from trauma. Carmen's childhood questions about why people came to their house for meetings and why her mother traveled to help clients who were often crying or upset led to important conversations about helping versus heroism. Olivia emphasized that helpers have experience and kindness and the desire to make things better, rather than special powers. Carmen's education in public health and social justice at the University of Miami, followed by her career as a healthcare law attorney, represented the natural evolution of her mother's advocacy work into the next generation. Growing up attending congressional hearings and medical conferences, Carmen understood how individual trauma could be transformed into systemic change. By 2033, the Marcus Williams Healthcare Advocacy Center operated in all 50 states with over 200 staff members, having served more than 100,000 patients. The organization had prevented an estimated 50 wrongful convictions while helping countless individuals navigate healthcare challenges they couldn't have addressed alone. International recognition led to similar programs in 12 other countries, demonstrating how local trauma-informed advocacy could scale to global impact. The model proved that comprehensive patient advocacy, combined with wrongful conviction prevention, addressed systemic healthcare access problems while protecting medical professionals from false accusations. The case's impact extended far beyond Olivia's personal recovery or organizational achievements. Detective Rodriguez became an advocate within the police department for thorough investigation of healthcare crimes, regularly speaking about avoiding rushed judgments based on circumstantial evidence. His transformation from the arresting officer to a wrongful conviction prevention consultant exemplified how institutions could learn from mistakes. Nursing schools incorporated discussions of appropriate boundaries, documentation practices, and legal protections into curricula. Professional organizations developed resources helping nurses navigate accusations while maintaining compassionate care. The balance between professional dedication and personal protection became a standard topic in healthcare education. Throughout her advocacy work, Olivia consistently rejected narratives suggesting her false accusation happened for a reason or that the murders of Marcus Williams, Teresa Martinez, and James Thompson served some greater purpose. Instead, she emphasized that people choose to create meaning from events that happen to them. This philosophical distinction became central to her speaking engagements and writing over the years. Personal suffering doesn't automatically create meaning or purpose. Those must be actively constructed through choices made over time. The trauma itself wasn't good. The response to trauma created positive outcomes. Media coverage occasionally portrayed Olivia in heroic terms that felt uncomfortable and inaccurate to her. She had not chosen to become an expert on wrongful convictions or healthcare advocacy. Those roles were forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. However, she had chosen how to respond to those circumstances, using knowledge gained through trauma to benefit others facing similar challenges. This choice, repeated daily over 30 years, created something that appeared heroic from outside but felt simply necessary from within. The distinction between heroism and helping became important in her public presentations, emphasizing agency and choice rather than exceptional personal qualities. Olivia's decision to remain in the Little Havana neighborhood where she was arrested demonstrated the possibility of transforming a side of trauma into a foundation for positive change. Many neighbors who witnessed her arrest became supporters and volunteers for the Advocacy Center, watching her evolution from victim to survivor to advocate. Mrs. Chen's tomato plants, maintained during Olivia's absence and continuing through her granddaughter's Elena's care, became symbols of community resilience and continuity. The garden where Olivia found peace during her darkest periods evolved into a space where her own grandchildren played, representing the possibility of joy growing from places where pain once seemed absolute. Photographs of Marcus Williams, Teresa Martinez, and James Thompson displayed in the Advocacy Center served as reminders that the positive work emerging from their deaths honored their memory without suggesting their murders served any purpose. Their families remained connected to the organization over the years, finding meaning in positive changes that emerged from their losses.
The memorial fund, established in Marcus Williams' name, grew to serve clients in 23 states. Sandra Martinez's mother became a community health educator. James Thompson's sister completed nursing school and worked in the ICU at Jackson Memorial, carrying forward the tradition of compassionate care that Olivia once represented there. Olivia Taylor's 30-year journey from false accusation to national healthcare advocacy demonstrates how individual choices in response to trauma can create systemic change that benefits thousands of people. Her experience illustrates that while suffering doesn't automatically create meaning, deliberate efforts to transform personal pain into community service can generate ripple effects extending far beyond the original victim. The Marcus Williams Healthcare Advocacy Center, the Taylor Protocols for Investigating Healthcare Crimes, and the thousands of patients who received advocacy services they otherwise couldn't access represent concrete manifestations of choosing agency over victimization. The children playing in Mrs. Chen's garden, bearing the names of murder victims whose deaths ultimately touched thousands of lives through advocacy work, symbolize the possibility of creating light in places where darkness once seemed absolute. This transformation required not forgetting or minimizing trauma, but rather choosing daily over 3 decades to use experience with injustice as a tool for fighting injustice against others. The distinction between suffering and response, between what happens to us and what we choose to do with what happens to us, became the philosophical foundation for a life that turned personal nightmare into national reform movements that continue protecting both patients and healthcare workers from preventable tragedies. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.